Sabbath. I see all these visitors. It's great. We are in John 20, verse 21. Now we'll read it in King James. And when you're there, say amen. All right. I love pages turning. Okay, here we go. Then said Jesus to them again, "Peace be unto you, as my Father hath sent me, even so send I you. May he that has an ear, and she that has an ear, let him hear."
To have with us Lincoln Steed. To some, he doesn't need an introduction, as many have seen him on Hope Channel, 3ABN, and different other programs. But for those that don't know him, Lincoln Steed is here, and he's here with his wife, Rosadelia. I don't know where Rosadelia is. There she is. Welcome, Rosadelia, as well. Elder Lincoln Steed is the editor of Liberty Magazine. How many of you guys heard of Liberty Magazine? Okay, just about everybody. It's a 200,000 circulation religious liberty journal which is distributed to political leaders, to judiciary, to lawyers and other thought leaders in North America, and through the International Religious Liberty Association to a larger international audience. It began 100 years ago by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The magazine argues for the rights of faith and practice for all. Elder Steed came to this position with extensive publishing and periodical editing experience. He was at the Pacific Press, Review and Herald, and Signs Publishing in Australia, where he was the book editor, house editor for Sabbath School Quarterlies, textbook editor, and editor of Listen and Winner magazine. The editing of temperance journals gave him considerable experience in working with government contacts and educators from most major denominations. He has long maintained that our religious liberties and our good relationship with society at large are inextricably intertwined. Elder Steed was born in Australia and began his education in his homeland of Australia, continuing his studies at Columbia Union College, now Washington Adventist University, they changed the name, in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and gaining a postgraduate degree at Andrews University. He is the author of the book, The Last Mountain, and numerous periodical articles. He's been all over the world, as you can imagine, such places like Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and many other places of violent religious conflict. While Associate Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the North American Division of the General Conference, he lives in Maryland with his family. Elder Lincoln Steed, it is truly an honor to have you here, and we're looking forward to learn more about what's going on in our world church in regards to religious liberty. Thank you, Elder Lincoln Steed. The time is yours.
My wife down this way so we could check out the beautiful beaches near here. So we've had a few extra hours before the weekend, and it is lovely. Not as lovely as usual, because usually where we live in Maryland, it's seriously cold this time of the year. But I have to tell you, it's been sort of like spring for December and so far in January. But I think today they're getting 5 or so inches of snow. It was great to talk to you this morning, and I'm sorry I came a couple of minutes later than I could have. But here's a second chance to share religious liberty with you. I want to tell you about something that impressed me when I was very young. I don't know how young, but certainly while I was still a teenager and maybe preteens. I remember, and it's burned into my mind, somewhere, maybe it was the school I attended or somewhere, I saw a very large painting, a reproduction of a painting, and the scene resonated with me as it does today. It was taken from the side of the scene, and there's a little boy in a blue velvet sort of a suit, like the little boy blue, but he's standing in front of a large wooden desk, and as I say, the look is at the side, and he's on a little step stool that you'd use in a kitchen type that thing, so he's standing up higher so he can see over the desk, and he's standing there with his hands behind his back. And the scene is loaded because behind him are 2 women holding each other and weeping, and behind him is a soldier with his arm around probably his sister. And the soldier, if I know what the painting's about, but even if you didn't, you could guess that it's from the 1600s in England, and he's one of what was known then as the New Model Army. Not quite today's soldier, but well on the way with utilitarian type armor, not just sort of flouncy stuff, but things that made a difference, and a very rough looking guy holding the daughter or the sister. And then behind the desk are some very stern-faced men. One of them's wearing the Puritan minister's typical hat, a high peak in the middle and a broad brim, looking severe. And then a couple of other officials leaning forward and asking the boy something. And then behind the boy, lounging on a chair, is a dragoon with his leather leggings and all the rest, again exuding power. And the caption on the painting is, "And when did you last see your father?" Very interesting, particularly when you know the background of that. And I studied history, both in Australia and here, and I found that in the US we tend to skip over this part of history, but it has everything to do with the United States and everything to do with you and I as Protestant Seventh-day Adventists and religious liberty today. Because the scene in that photograph, or that painting, took place really not quite 100 years before the American War of Independence. And it was in England, and at that time, even though it was nominally a Protestant country, Protestantism was not quite as settled as you might have imagined. They were barely past the persecutions of Bloody Mary, as she was known. Henry VIII's Catholic daughter had persecuted Protestants in England, sent many of them to the stake, burned at the stake. But as it came past her rule to Charles I, a Scottish king who was given rule over England and Scotland, religious conflict was just endemic in England. The Puritans were rising to prominence. And remember, a Puritan covers a whole bunch of religious sects, but in total, they were people that were reading their Bible and were living pure and holy and circumspect lives. So it was a religious revival, and often it had overtones of legality and, do whatever and die doing it. But the Puritans were rising, and they took great offense at what was happening at that time because the king appeared to be moving England back to Catholicism. His wife was Roman Catholic. His friends and sensibilities were in Catholic Europe, and he was ruling very high-handedly, dismissed Parliament for many years, and he made the mistake of calling Parliament back to get money to fight Scotland over a matter of, it was called the Bishops' Wars, as I remember. So it was a religious conflict in Scotland. He wanted to intervene. And when he called Parliament, within hours of them being called back, they got into a dispute with the king. He tried to arrest the leaders. They went over the road and formed an army, and the Civil War was on. And for several years, Protestant revolutionary soldiers fought the king and his Catholic retainers. How many of you knew of this history? See, it's unknown largely in this country. And after a number of years, the parliamentarians, led by a Puritan general named Oliver Cromwell, won a final victory and took the king captive and put him on trial in Parliament as a traitor to the people. And his singular act that doomed him was that when he was first imprisoned, he'd conspired through back channels to bring a Catholic army to relieve him. So they cut his head off publicly. And Oliver Cromwell became not the king. They offered it to him, as they did with George Washington, but he became Lord Protector of England, a Protestant revolutionary. It was they called it a republic, the rule of the people. As far as I can see from history, it was only the Second Republic. The first was the Republic of Rome, then the Republic in England for that little period of time, and then the American Republic. And now, in our era, there's republics popping up all over. But it was a novelty at that point. And before the French Revolution, for Protestants in England to kill a king whose singular line of defense was that he was anointed by God and they were opposing God to challenge his rule, was as shocking as anything that followed in the French Revolution when the French king and the aristocracy were killed, but not such a moral loading to the situation. And that painting that I was explaining happened sometime during the Civil War when the Puritan army were hunting down the king and his associates. Civil wars are never good. Civil wars are never good. And I'm not saying we should identify in this case with an aristocratic family that probably had Catholic sensibilities. But the invocation I want to make there is when religious forces are at play, as they have been many times and are again in our day, things can get very rough, very rough. And individual people have to stand up and be counted. And the title that I gave to the sermon today is Witness. And I don't just take it from that painting. If you have already seen, and next week you guaranteed will see, the campaign materials for our Liberty campaign this year, we've called it Witness. Because a big part of religious liberty is not just the things that many people imagine with religious liberty, getting Sabbath accommodation or being free from trouble and so on. Those are byproducts of a situation where there is religious freedom. But we are called to actively use our liberty, the liberty of the gospel that Paul spoke about. The gospel of liberty, he called it a number of times. We're to use that to stand up, to stand forth and to speak out about what we believe. And in that painting, I see a little boy called to account, in his case, for what his father believed. But one way or another, all of us, perhaps at some time in our life, sometimes without us even realizing it, are put in a position where we're required by an inner force to speak of what we believe. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus, in a long sequence of instructions there, said something that most people don't even want to acknowledge or are not aware of. He said this, very interesting. He says, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes shall be they of his own household." "He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. He that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it." Obviously, in the spiritual sense and the experiential sense, of course Jesus came to bring peace. He came to pacify our individual lives that are in turmoil because of sin. And Jesus says, great peace have they that love thy word. Of course there's peace. But as far as the effect that Christianity, that the message that Christ came to bring to this world, its effect is not always peaceable. In fact, just as those spirits in the hogs, remember in the Gadaran hills there, when the spirits were brought out of the maniac, they were sent into the pigs, and they were just tumbling down into the water because they were full of agitation. And the message of Christ, the fullness of the gospel, is not going to bring peace generally. We have to understand that. And in relating that to religious liberty today, I just want to leave you with this. You can never guarantee the sort of peace for religious practice that we seem to be having now. And in a certain perverse way or unique way, it may not be even for our own good. We're all culpable and responsible to what we do individually. And so I've got to be careful. I stand and make a comment. Maybe I'm not witnessing enough. But I can tell you our membership in North America and Australia and most of the Western countries, our great sin is that we're invisible. We're not generally standing forth and explaining our faith to our neighbours and to our community. They don't know who we are. If they did, we'd probably have more trouble. And this is the great irony of religious liberty. Great irony. In Jude, a book that has a dubious provenance, you should read how and why different books came into the Bible. Jude is accepted and it's fine, but who knows who Jude was or where it came from. But he says some wonderful things. In one of the comments, he says we should contend for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. Contending for it, not accepting it, and wonderful, I keep it in my little treasure box. Jesus said, if you keep your talent hidden, it'll be taken from you. Faith has to be exercised to be alive. And what we're trying to emphasize during this campaign, that I want to place with you and just drive home today, as Christians who have liberty, with the Religious Liberty Department, we're not working to get it for you, nor to keep it for you. You have it. The Bible says, I've set before you an open door, which no man. Keep that in mind. You are free. He says that Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, you're free indeed. So the only freedom that matters is freedom from sin. And in accepting Jesus, you have it. But you are immediately enlisted in the army of witnessing. And, I often preach too on Pilgrim's Progress. That's from the same era. John Bunyan was a soldier in that parliamentary army. When he was fighting in the army, he was a bit of a foul-mouthed, unregenerate guy, but he got religion a bit later. And his take on his spiritual experience was a military one, not a mystery, because he was a soldier. But we're on a battle and a march, and we're heading toward that city, and along the way there is giant despair, there's the lions and all the rest, but there also is the delectable mountains. There also at the end is that celestial city and the shining ones. We really, each of us, I think, need to catch that vision that will draw us on and encourage and inspire us to speak out. Now, it's one of the privileges of a number of people, not just at the North American division, but all across our division, people that are working for religious liberty. They have a lot of opportunity to speak to public officials, whether it's a mayor or a congressman or a senator, and sometimes a governor or even presidents. And we talk to them. And it's surprising to me that they will listen to you in different ways, but they want to hear what you have to say if you say it honestly. But it's not just people that have been placed in these positions. Maybe your neighbor has always been wondering what it means to be a Seventh-day Adventist, and a word in season, not a word spat at someone when they don't want to hear it. Obviously, there is dynamic of interrelationships, but when the moment is ripe, tell them why you have faith, what it means to you. A few years ago, I got on one of my many jags of YouTube. I've been telling my wife, and she's not quite convinced, that I like to go on YouTube and watch different documentaries. And at the moment, I've been watching a lot of scientific ones about reality and quantum theory and so on, make your head spin. But a few years ago, I spent a lot of time watching debates between Christopher Hitchens and different, usually people of faith, whether they were Muslims, Christians, or whatever. And Christopher Hitchens had been an inspiration to me for decades because he's one of the greatest writers in American journalism, and he'd always been a cynic and an atheist. But in his last few years, he made it a career that he would go around debating publicly figures of faith. And it was entertaining to watch because invariably he would destroy them. Not necessarily because his position was better, but he was a very good debater. But I noticed that there were at least 2 cases where he was taken to a draw and morally defeated. It was Tony Blair and the Reverend Al Sharpton, 2 figures you wouldn't guess. I know Tony Blair is a committed Roman Catholic, and he'd been, in his retirement from being Prime Minister, he'd been given a charter to bring some religious peace to the Middle East, and he heads a religious think tank. I think they're based in New England somewhere. And Al Sharpton, I first noticed him when he was telling big stories about a girl named Brawley that had been abused. Turned out he'd made up the story, so he didn't have a good origin. But in his recent years, this minister of religion has, spoken fairly well about major issues. But you wouldn't guess either of these could defeat a major debater who knew his history upside down. It seemed like he had everything in his mental fingertips and had the gift of articulation as well. But I noticed with both of them, he was sort of gagging. He couldn't really knock them down. And why? Not because they understood history better than him, not because they understood logic and rhetoric better than him. It was as simple as in both of their cases they said, I don't know what you believe, but I know that Jesus has changed my life. This is what he means to me. This is what he's done to my thinking, and this is what I want to do in response. That is a powerful thing. And every one of us have something to say in that regard, and if not, we can pray and work toward it, because that's what the whole story's about for us. And the promise is, in fact, it was the aim of the disciples after the upper room, not before the upper room. Who will be the greatest in your kingdom? Lots of that going on in the building that I work in. It just drives me up the wall. But after the upper room, their burden was to get out, to have a chance to talk to someone, to share what they'd experienced. And there's no gainsaying that. That is as real as you. And if the person is impressed by you and sees something shining out of your face, they'll want it. And of course, if you live in a country where religious allowances and religious freedom in the civil sense is restricted, it could be hard, but still not impossible. My father's long gone now. But I remember being quite impressed as a younger guy when he came back from Bulgaria, where he went a number of times during the Soviet Union phase of rule. And with temperance, he had a bit of an in with the government. But he went there as a guest of the government, and he brought back a photograph on one occasion of them having a prayer session with the top leaders of the rulers of Bulgaria. I mean, who would have the guts to try that? But he had become friendly with them. He was always talking about what religion meant to him. And when, in their homes with the wives and just in a social situation, he invited them to read the Bible and to pray together, they did it. And yet on the face of it, these were regimes dedicated to wiping religion from the face of the planet. So there has to be a place for gaining the confidence of someone, being genuine, not exploitive. Christians should never become the spiritual equivalent of used car salesmen. I don't know about you, but I have inbuilt resistance from someone that's just trying to smarmily sell something to me or push their view on me. I don't care for that. And Jehovah's Witnesses clearly, in our minds at least, sort of fill that role. We don't want to be someone that, knocks on the door and then pushes it open and will never stop talking till you call the police type stuff. No. But in the real world, if we go about, as it says with Jesus, he went about as someone who wished their good. If someone can sense that you're friendly to them because you like them, you want to talk to them, and then taking advantage of that and sharing the faith that's within you. That has power. And, I've got 2 children, well, not really children anymore. One's 21 and one's 18. But, we decry the fact that both of them are always on the phone and social media. Social media, there's no question, has changed the world. It can allow someone to organize a demonstration very rapidly. But you don't need social media to spread the gospel. Remember, in one lifetime, the disciples spread the knowledge of Christ and his saving power to the known world. And the mathematics is easy to show that if as often as you can in all of your contacts you're sharing something, it will explode across all civilizations in weeks and months, not decades and centuries. There is power in personal witness, which we are called to. You know, very often on religious liberty over the years, I've taken whole sermons on Nebuchadnezzar, and we had our lesson again, I think, recently on it. But it's powerful. And when I look back on Ellen White's writings on religious liberty, and if you're ever moved to it, contact the White Estate. They have a beautiful collection of Ellen White's comments on religious liberty. It's in 8.5 by 11, just typewritten sheets, but they charge like $5 for it. And a lot of it is made up of excerpts from her other books, like Patriarchs and Prophets and so on, where she's talking about characters like Daniel in front of Nebuchadnezzar. But you know, we study it, but I don't think we quite understand, because if the president walked down this aisle today, not likely, in fact you'd know him about 5 miles away, because I've seen in Washington the motorcade of the president. There's like 30, 40 SUVs, an ambulance or two trailing along behind it, about 20 motorcycle police leading the way. Big noise, right? But if the president or any civil leader appeared, you know, we might be a little bit embarrassed or awestruck, but still, we know this is another person. We're not a fear of life and limb if they appeared. But what about Daniel? The potentates that Nebuchadnezzar represented back then, they had the power of life or death over you. You just look cross-eyed at them. In fact, many of the rulers wouldn't allow you to look at them. As recently as World War II in Japan, the citizenry could not see the emperor. They were not allowed to look at him. If he passed by, they would bow and look at the earth. So here, obviously a young guy, we don't quite know how young, but probably a teenager, Nebuchadnezzar and his friends, taken at knife point and amid the burning destruction of Jerusalem, taken to a faraway city where the despot of the day lived, Nebuchadnezzar, who was bloodthirsty to the extreme. And here, Daniel, first of all, could talk to Arioch, the leader of the eunuchs, which is a troubling thought of Daniel and his friends, already suffering a bit for their faith, but ending up talking to Nebuchadnezzar, who had already said, the people that didn't know the dream, kill them. And he comes before the king and could speak to him as to another human being. That in itself is remarkable. And of course it shows remarkable faith. But we're told in the Bible we're not to give thought ahead of time what we're to say. It will be given to you. But like everything in life, what's given to us has to come from somewhere. The older I get, I discover things that I learned in school and didn't pay a lot of attention to, but they were there. They come flooding back. You often find in situations things that have left your memory come back. Has to be there to start with. If you have a faith and an experience in God, it may have its ups and downs, but it'll be refined in the fire and tested in adversity and be revealed if you have an underlying confidence in the Lord. I remember years ago hearing a story. It was sort of a joke, but there's some truth in it, that this young man had a wonderful spiritual experience where he'd come to the Lord. It was a deliverance and something so dramatic that he used to travel around from church to church telling the story. It was his Christian experience. And then one fateful day at this meeting, probably a little bit like me this morning, he was in a bit of a confusion and he left his paper at home and he got up in front of everyone and he doesn't have the experience. He says, "I've lost my Christian experience." But you can only share what's real to you. It can't be an academic cheat sheet on something. The same when we're brought before authorities. Of course God will order our mind, and if we have faith and security in Him, but He can't give us what we never had. And I'm back to what I was trying to say this morning. A.T. Jones and the early Adventists. When the stress to gather close to the Lord and to gain that experience that will strengthen us more so for going through the trial. But, the trial for us is a testing time, an exciting time. It's something that Adventists, I do believe, have missed by and large. I remember it was also down south, but not as south as here. Once I had an afternoon meeting, and as I was talking to the group, the elderly gentleman, maybe even my age, I don't think I'm elderly, but he looked elderly to me. And he said, tell us, he says, when we should be afraid. I don't think we should ever be afraid. But we should have a sober response to certain situations. But it's worth remembering what lies ahead is bad enough that Jesus said, looking forward, he says, unless those days be shortened, no flesh will be saved. He didn't say no faithful, nothing. No human being can make it through it unless they're shortened. But we should remember that the plagues, the punishments, the consequence, which by and large is what they are, these fall on the wicked world and the wicked people. God's people are not selected for trouble, except as a reaction from those around you, and at times we're promised particular protection. The difference or the situation is exactly like it was in Egypt with God's people there, waiting deliverance. The plagues are falling, and except for the first few that had a general application, because you couldn't escape that, it was just the situation was, stormy or dry or fires or whatever. But once the things became particularly noxious, it was only on the wicked. And if the blood was on the doorpost, they were delivered. And it will be the same for us today. But what is certain as we head to the end of time? We will be required to speak for our faith. It's a contradiction. You can't be God's people expecting that grand moment and you're hidden in a hole somewhere. That's the test, to go through it speaking of God, and in spite of all the howls and the jeers and the threats against you, which sometimes might appear to take effect, but generally God's people are going to be swept through triumphant. That's what we need to keep in mind. This is not a depressing time, it's a challenging time. As Ellen White says a number of times, speaking to the Adventists of her day and looking forward, she says, we are the church militant. We are not yet the church triumphant. But we're to be militant. What's militant? Not a threat to the country or anything, but active, doing something, moving, on the march. There was some, even in the back room, we were talking about Iran. And Iran's in the news a lot lately. And I have a bit of a soft spot for Iran because when I was a young man, my father took us there when the Shah was ruling it. Wonderful country. Wonderful country. And I particularly remember meeting with, my parents took us to an Adventist camp meeting in Iran. I've never heard since anybody, even at the General Conference, make a comment about Adventists in that country. Not a bad country. And even the Muslims are not bad. It's a country hijacked by a radical form of a dangerous religion. But it's a wonderful country. And it's an interesting country too. A biblical story that we all know very well, it told in the book of Esther, comes to root in Iran. They have Queen Esther's tomb in Iran. They also know who she married. She supposedly married again after, wasn't Ahasuerus? But think of Queen Esther, again, one of the diaspora, the scattered faithful from Jerusalem, which we are. I don't know about you, I feel scattered even from Australia. We're all sort of rootless. The US, a little bit like Australia. This is the land of the rootless. We only have a sense of home as a Christian in that eternal kingdom. But how about that young girl? I think foolishly entered the beauty pageant because it really had overtones of concubinage. But she ended up as the queen, the favorite queen of that great kingdom. And at a moment when her people were threatened, when a religious pogrom was about to take place, she was encouraged by her cousin to go and speak to the king. It's a grand moment. And if you read it there in the book of Esther, which, people have remarked on it, not a great overt mention of God at all. But for the Jews, this is the central story. The Feast of Purim they celebrate every year is the salvation of their people by this young woman who, as she hesitated a bit, her cousins, Mordecai he says, this, who knows, he says, that you're brought to the kingdom for such a time as this. And he says, and if you don't go, someone else will. It brings me to mind of 35 years ago when my wife and I came back from Australia. I'd thought that I was there for the rest of our life. And I got the call to Pacific Press, which at the time was collapsing. And now no one remembers they were ever in trouble and instead closed down the Review. But I can remember her saying, why should we go to the US? Why go back? That's perhaps where there's going to be a lot of trouble. Certainly Sunday law initially, maybe earlier than other parts of the world. Why go back? And I remember telling her, I had an inkling of it. I said, who knows what God, I think God's in this, but who knows what his plan is? Maybe his plan is to have me be some important linkage in something that doesn't involve me. And, we can hold that idea at any point. You may not be the one to stand before, the Homeland Security Director when they're deciding whether or not to enforce Sunday observance on Adventists. But maybe you talking to the local mayor or your neighbor about something is in a chain of circumstance that empowers and encourages that one that has that contact. That's what we have to realize. And I have to tell you on even that comment I made to my wife, she went ahead of me on the advice of the lawyers at the time, and I traveled by myself, and at the time I was scared silly of flying, and I had 3 flights on jumbo jets. I really was not looking forward to it, and I had lots of cases, and I remember struggling on the first one, and they fussed with me. They wouldn't take my luggage initially, and I finally got past all of the objections and get down to my seat, and I found that there was a seat missing in front of mine where I could put everything on the floor. I've never seen that since on a jumbo jet. And then the second flight, when I got on the second plane, another jumbo jet, full, and I get to my row, and it was totally empty. So I was able to, the first time in my life, sleep on the all-night flight. And the third flight from Hawaii, I remember expecting God to have cleared the way for me. And I was very bothered when I got on the plane, and there were 2 other people in my row, and I'd had trouble getting the luggage put away, and looked down each row, just jam full. Since 2008, all planes are full, but it didn't used to be the case. And I remember being in a sort of a fit as we flew from Hawaii out toward Los Angeles. And after some time, the man next to me started talking. And they drew me into conversation very slowly. And it was he and his wife from Sheffield, England. And they said they were coming back from Australia, but they have a business in Sheffield. And they said, we feel like strangers in our own country anymore. And they gave many reasons, crime and so on. And they said to me at one point, they said, we are traveling the world looking for something. And so I had the chance to tell them about many of the things that characterize our faith in the Bible and the spirit of the times we live in and what this means and so on. And they were both leaning close and, yes, we believe this, don't we? And then the man just shook me upright when he said, I believe we were to come on this trip just to meet you. I don't know if that's true, but it resonated with my comment to my wife. Maybe that's all it was about, that I was called to the US to have a connection on the way. We don't know. We won't know until we're in heaven. But we do have to know that it's our obligation and our liberty, our call to freedom to speak and to witness wherever. The one Bible story that's inspired me the whole time I've been editor of Liberty magazine as Paul. Of course, I can make a pretty good case that Christianity is pretty much shaped by Paul. Theologically, Paul's the guy that set it all in place. Other than that, we really only have the Gospels telling a narrative, but Paul gave it a meaning, and he translated it into the mindset of the Greco-Roman culture. Else it would be in a Judaic way of thinking, which is very different. Believe me, even looking at the Bible as literature, even the form of Hebrew poetry is alien to English poetry. But Paul couldn't be stopped. And there's that classic scene that you know, but I want to put it in this context and repeat it again. You know, Paul in Acts chapter 26, before before Agrippa, I think it was, and the governor Festus, they gave him a chance to talk. And remember, he was only in prison because of his own actions. As an expedient to gain protection from the Judaizers who would have torn him limb from limb, he appealed to Rome for some justice. So they arrested him. And as a result, we believe he ended up before Caesar himself. But, Paul didn't have to be a prisoner. But as a prisoner, he languished for years before he was sent to Rome. And on one of these occasions, brought before the governor, they said, let him speak. I didn't, all that talking, I didn't go to it. In Acts chapter 26, he tells his story, which is, again, pretty much the only way of witnessing. In Acts chapter 26, he tells the story about he was a persecutor, and we were all on that side at one point. I was born in the Adventist church. I'm a fifth generation. Or is it my son? Yeah, fourth or fifth generation. Go back to the first LEs that came to Australia just before Ellen White went down there. It's all I knew growing up. But it doesn't mean I was ever initially a converted Christian. You have to have a moment when your life has turned. And I'm quite fixed on that. I have many peers that say, oh, no, you don't have a conversion. You just sort of grow into the faith. I don't believe that. It doesn't mean they're bad people, but I believe at some point in some way, God has to grab you by the throat and you have to change your mindset. You're not perfect, but your point of reference shifts. Because as it says, the heart of man is evil and deceitful. And Paul had that moment on the Damascus Road, which is most interesting if you read even his account. He saw the light. He heard the thunder, the voice. His companions, the most they could pick up was a bit of a disturbance. Same with Jesus in the temple. Remember, Jesus heard the voice from heaven saying, this is my son, I'm pleased. Most people heard a thunder. If you're not spiritually inclined, it doesn't really make much difference to you. And Paul says, he was talking in chapter 26, talking to the king. He says, at midday, O king, I saw in the way a light from heaven above the brightness of the sun, shining round about me, and with them that journeyed with me. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice saying unto me, and saying in the Hebrew tongue, interesting, I thought angels spoke in English, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And I said, who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. And in cutting forward, this is a moment to him. Cutting forward in verse 19, he says, therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient unto the heavenly vision. That's really what we have to be ready to answer at some point. Whether it's from the call from heaven or our conscience, have we been disobedient to the vision given to us? Different people answer different ways, that's to be sure. But if we're resisting it, we're on the wrong side of the compulsion curve, I think. I was not disobedient. Not disobedient. What I want to end with, I started with the call to war. the son against the father, and the daughter-in-law against the mother-in-law, and the mother, and so on. It's true. Jesus laid out that, and it was true in his day, and it's true today on a certain level. But at the end of the whole experience, when Jesus gave the charge to his disciples, it says he breathed on them, and he says, "Peace be unto you. As my Father hath sent me, so send I you." I grew up in the Adventist church. I've never left it, but it's become more of a work for me than it was when I was growing up. There it was just the culture I was in. But something that used to bother me, the General Conference sessions particularly, when I went there, they always had a list of the countries yet to enter, a check mark next to ones we were in. And the idea was said openly sometimes, once we check them all off, the Lord will come. You know, talk about a limited vision of what God's doing. First of all, I've been in countries where there's a check mark and we're invisible, not least of which this country. 300 plus million nowadays, and we're 1 million. Hardly an overwhelming presence. But it's worth remembering, as I said before, that in one generation, those dozen and the 50 at least beyond that, not a dozen, 11, they took the gospel to the known world. Surely we can take it to our known world. Much easier for 1 million people than a handful. I want to share, in conclusion, something with you to show you the spirit of the times, both of that painting that I started with and the times that we're living in and living through. But again, referencing it to that British Civil War, which I think has everything to do with understanding religion in this country. The Puritans ruled England not for long after that Civil War. Their rule was only challenged really by disgust. People didn't like their false morality. But it lasted as long as Oliver Cromwell lived, and he died suddenly. Even some people wondered if he was poisoned. And as soon as he died, amazingly, the people had had enough of a lack of entertainments and that, and they invited the king's son back, and the monarchy re-established. And of course, those that killed the king's father were hunted down, and many of them were hung. But out of that era came something that is central to Adventism. A secretary, or the secretary to Oliver Cromwell for foreign languages, was a man named John Milton. Anyone heard of his name? My wife has. She heard me talking about it. You know, John Milton, you should remember from high school, but again, American language literature plays precedence over English. You might read about Shakespeare, but Milton is easily second only to Shakespeare in the English language. A great author. He was secretary to John Milton. He was a Puritan and wrote many, many books. And just for curiosity, if you're interested in the impeachment, go and read Milton's, one of his books he wrote on the tenure of kings and magistrates. He gave their reason behind executing the king. And I've seen it cited lately in the impeachment. And it definitely was cited by Thomas Jefferson in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, because the reasons he gave for why their allegiance was removed from the King of England were the same reasons that Milton had put forth barely a lifetime before. Great influence. When the king's son came and re-established the kingly rule again, tens of thousands of Puritans fled to this country as refugees. They were the ones that gave the colour to this country. The Plymouth Rock group were historically a nice story, but almost irrelevant to changing the society here. But tens of thousands of revolutionaries who had had a religious republic in England, and they came here, most of them to the south. They definitely coloured and created the religious right, if you like, and the sense of exceptionalism that this country's held on to. But John Milton wrote many things, but most particularly, he wrote a book-length poem called Paradise Lost, and a follow-up book called Paradise Regained. Paradise Lost tells the story of the rebellion in heaven, the creation of man and his fall, temptation by Satan, and the expulsion from Eden. Paradise Regained tells the story of the temptation in the wilderness. Ellen White clearly drew heavily on both books in Great Controversy and in a follow-up book called Confrontation. And I've heard Adventists say emptily that Adventists came up with the Great Controversy theme. It's not true, and I'm glad it's not true, because this has been an understanding in Protestantism for a long, long time. And during that Civil War, there were many factions of the Puritans. There was one faction called the Levelers. They believed they were at the end of the world, at the judgment day, and they were to stand before the judgment bar of God as equals. So in advance of that, they would level the hedges and society, and it was an egalitarian proto-communist sort of a movement. Another very significant movement, which Oliver Cromwell himself most favoured, was called the Fifth Monarchy Men. They were reading Daniel 2, the image, and they believed that they were in the fifth and final kingdom before the return of Christ. The millenarian thinking was overwhelming at that time. They believed they were at the end of time, and it was based on prophecy. But this idea of the great and enduring conflict between good and evil was clearly enunciated by Milton and picked up, thankfully, by Adventists through Ellen White and her prophetic vision. I just want to conclude by reading you a few lines from Milton. If nothing else, you'll get an insight into what literature class might be like. And I hope I can read it, because my eyes are failing and the type's small, but it'll give you an idea. This is at the end, when the angel is, as the Bible in brief outline explains, the angels told Adam and Eve what was to come, about how a Savior would come, bruising the head and yet the heel, and you'll bruise the head. Satan will be overcome. So here's the dialogue. Grabbed the wrong page. Here's the dialogue. It's only about 3 paragraphs. And it's a long book, by the way. Samuel Johnson, one of the great biographers of that time, commented on Milton's poem, and he said, "None wished it longer." So this is just a short bit. But Adam replies to the angel, and he says, "But say, if our deliverer up to heaven must reascend, what will betide the few, his faithful, left among the unfaithful herd, the enemies of truth? Who then shall guide his people? Who defend? Will they not deal worse with his followers than with him they dealt?" "Be sure they will," said the angel. "But from heaven he to his own a comforter will send, the promise of the Father, who shall dwell his Spirit within them, and the law of faith working through love upon their hearts shall write, to guide them in all truth, and also arm with spiritual armor, able to resist Satan's assaults and quench his fiery darts. What man can do against them, not afraid, though to the death, against such cruelties with inward consolations recompensed, and often supported so as shall amaze their proudest persecutors. For the Spirit poured first on his apostles, whom he sends to evangelize the nations. Then on all baptized shall them with wondrous gifts endue to speak all tongues and do all miracles, as did their Lord before them. Thus they win great numbers of each nation to receive with joy the tidings brought from heaven. At length their ministry performed and race well run, their doctrine and their story written left, they die. But in their room, as they forewarn, wolves shall succeed for teachers, grievous wolves, who all the sacred mysteries of heaven to their own vile advantage shall turn, of lucre and ambition, and the trust with superstitions, and the truth with superstitions and traditions taint, left only in those written records pure, though not but by the Spirit understood. Then they shall seek to avail themselves of names, places, and titles, and with these to join secular power, though feigning still to act by spiritual, to themselves appropriating the Spirit of God, promised alike and given to all believers. And from that pretense, spiritual laws by carnal power shall force on every conscience, laws which none shall find left in them enrolled, or what the Spirit within shall on the heart engrave. What will they then but force the Spirit of grace itself and bind his consort liberty? What but unbuild his living temples, built by faith to stand, their own faith, not another's? For on earth who against faith and conscience can be heard infallible? Yet many will presume, whence heavy persecution shall arise on all who in the worship persevere of spirit and truth. The rest, far greater part, will deem in outward rites and specious forms religion satisfied. Truth shall retire, bestruck with slanderous darts, and works of faith rarely be found. So shall the world go on, to good malignant, to bad men benign, under her own weight groaning, till the day appear of respiration to the just, and vengeance to the wicked, at return of him so lately promised to thy aid, the woman's seed, obscurely then foretold, now amply known, thy Saviour and thy Lord. Last in the clouds from heaven to be revealed, to dissolve Satan with his perverted world, then raise from the conflagrant mass, purged and refined, new heavens, new earth, ages of endless date, founded in righteousness and peace and love. That's a pretty good outline of the latter days of this world and the promise of victory to come. Remember, that came out of civil war, faith fighting to be heard, and perhaps on the other side, little boys there standing. When did you last see your father? What does it mean to you to be a Protestant? Better mean something. And I hope and pray that in the years and days ahead, religious liberty will be an operative principle for each of us, not just something that we benefit from, fought on our behalf, but that we are part of in our own witness and proclamation. God bless you.